Hey guys, Joe Youngblood. I'm a whitetail habitat designer with Whitetail Habitat Solutions alongside Jeff Sturgis, Dylan, and Kevin. I hope you're doing well. I wanted to continue our simple series today, touch on bedding areas a little bit, how we look at them when we're designing a parcel. I know you guys are thinking about them a lot, or maybe you're designing your own parcel. But why are they so important? The neat thing about bedding areas is that it really helps us elongate the movement and be more specific on where we want deer to hide and move throughout daylight. And it helps us. It helps us define morning stands and evening stands and really just make it a little more relatable piece, hold more deer on our property. They're an excellent tool, and personally I'm seeing just a lot of advantages now that I have enhanced bedding areas on my own property. Tree types. There's definitely advantages to looking at the trees that are in the areas where you're creating your bedding area. For example, I was on a piece of property we were doing a plan for over the weekend, and there were quite a few conifers and a few other different trees, some oaks, but there were these almost pockets perfectly placed around the property that allow them to go in and pick that area and say that we're going to get good regeneration here. There's a lot of different variables we're going to be talking about here in a second, like sunlight, and when we get that, it's advantageous to us to look at the trees and see what trees are in the area that we're going to be cutting for our bedding area. If it's some type of aspen and poplar, as many of you know, 7,000 plus shoots per acre through that lateral root system, there's a huge advantage to picking out a bedding area in accordance with the tree type. So in an area like that, we're going to get a lot of good regeneration. We're going to get a lot of food for the deer, and it's going to work out better than maybe some other species that aren't going to have that. Sunlight to food, guys. Remember that the first two feedings in the day are browse. That's why we oftentimes relate oaks and chestnuts to the bedding areas and hardwood, woody regeneration. And when we do these cuttings, we are creating more food for the deer. However, we need sunlight. If sunlight is not going to be getting to it, we do these cuttings, or maybe the trees aren't, again, good for regenerative purposes, then it might end up being a little bit more of a waste, or possibly just not as advantageous as you wanted it to be. But if we are getting that, we need to make sure that the size is appropriate. If the size is too small, then we might not be getting the sunlight required to get the regeneration. If the trees are tall around and you're not looking at the appropriate direction, then it very well could be kind of a waste to cut a pocket that's not going to be able to get the growth that you wanted. It's not going to have the food or the cover, and the deer just simply aren't going to want to bed there as much. When we talk about size, we're typically looking at something fairly small, 1/10 or less of an acre. You could look at 40, 50, 60 feet by 60 feet, something around there. Enough so that the deer can feel comfortable, but also small enough that we can separate them. We could have multiple family groups spread out in these different bedding areas, not see each other, and hold more deer. When we do that, we're able to turn these specific bedding areas into areas where we can bring does up closer to food plots, have more room for those younger bucks, and ultimately more room for the larger bucks in the back, what we refer to as depth of cover quite often. But if we single out certain areas where we don't have enough bedding, maybe one of those groups aren't going to get the same type of love that others would. And if the does aren't there, then it's going to fall back and the domino effect will take place. The younger bucks aren't going to be there and the older bucks aren't going to be there. So we want to make sure that not just size, but also location of the bedding areas are coming into play as well, so that we have enough room. Density differences. I was thinking about this quite a bit the last couple of days. Again, the clients that we were just seeing really came into my mind just because there are big differences in areas where it might be more hardwood oriented, and other areas where maybe it was cut fairly heavily in the last 6 to 10 years, and you just have this mid length or height regeneration. A lot of 3, 4, 5, 6 inch in diameter trees, things that something like a forestry mulcher could really do well in. But when we talk about these bedding pockets and when we draw them out even for clients, we might be meaning the same thing, but these two things are actually, quite different as far as creating them. In one, maybe a larger hardwood area, we might be dropping trees, possibly doing a few hinge cuts, and creating additional side cover, of course, food, things like that for the deer. We're in a higher density, very thick, maybe a lot of poplar aspen regenerative area where we're creating bedding pockets. It might purely be that we take in the forestry mulcher and we make that 40, 50, 60 foot pocket, and spreading those out every 40, 50, 60 or so yards kind of makes it a little easier to remember. So with that, you have two pretty much totally different ways of going about it. One, you're taking a chainsaw in, you're felling trees, possibly looking at hinge cuts for certain purposes. And in another, you're taking a tool, you're kind of clearing it out. In both of these, though, you could add further diversity, maybe adding a couple conifers, things that, depending on the sunlight required, that are going to do well and provide additional cover, thermal cover for the deer. When we take all these into account, we're really going to be able to add the cover required to hold everything from doe to mature bucks, to spread them out, to have these bedding pockets in enough different areas where we can house different family groups. And of course, these should all be away from our access so that when we're sneaking around to morning versus evening stands, we have plenty of room to slip in and wait for those deer to come back. Of course, generally speaking, in our bedding areas, we are looking for those deer to come back from the ag, maybe even potentially some holding plots, things like that, where they are going back to bed and we're waiting for them. The other main benefit to that, and why many of us think that the morning time is the best time to shoot those mature bucks, is that we have a much less chance of spooking the deer. It should be a 95+% chance that those deer are out of that area, they're making their way back, so when we go in, there's really not much of a chance of us spooking them, unlike an evening stand where those deer are moving to that third feeding. We don't really know if they're on their feet already, how far away they could be, and there's a little bit more chance that we could spook those deer. So I hope that helps. Hope it gives you something to think about, especially if you're doing things yourself and designing your own property. But if you guys have any questions, leave them in the comments below, and we'll see you next time.